What happens when a sacred warning is dismissed as mere village gossip? When a deep-seated fear whispers the truth, yet pride compels you to close your ears. Can a family's stubborn disbelief shatter a destiny that was meant to be golden? On the sun-baked, red earth of the village of Yo, where the ancient Iroko tree still cast the longest shadow, a choice was made. A single, irreversible choice that prioritized convenience over consequence. Not a single stone was broken, nor a voice raised in anger, yet the fabric of their fate began to fray in that moment. What they believed to be a simple decision about land and legacy was, in fact, the beginning of a years-long debt, a price they would pay not in money, but in grief. The stakes were not just wealth or poverty, but the very soul of the family line, the piece of their ancestral name. They risked losing the most precious thing they owned, the ability to simply look at each other without seeing the coming sorrow. The cost of ignoring wisdom is always heavier than the burden of obeying it. This isn't just a story about land or a prophecy. It's a story about the devastating distance between hearing the truth and accepting it, a tale of how generational pride can become a curse. Before the darkness came for them, there was Chinya. She was a mother, a wife, and the reluctant keeper of an ominous family secret. Welcome to Stories by the King, where every story carries a heartbeat, and every truth demands to be heard. Now, before we begin, where in the world are you watching from? Is it morning in Lagos, evening in Nairobi, or midnight in London? Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now, lean in. Because this isn't just about what happened, it's about the quiet disaster of an ignored warning. The sun always set in you with a fiery, golden orange spectacle, but on the evening the decision was finalized, the light felt cold, almost mocking. Chinya, a woman whose beauty was only matched by the sharp anxiety in her eyes, watched her husband, Paul, sign the final papers with a flourish of self-satisfaction. The papers transferred a crucial piece of ancestral land, the land where the village Babalawo, the wise elder, had performed the rites of passage for generations, to a large, foreign-owned construction company. The company promised Paul, in exchange, not only a vast sum of money that would change their lives instantly but also a supervisory role in the new luxury estate. We are moving from a mud house to a mansion, Chinya. What good is an old, dusty patch of earth compared to this? Paul's voice boomed, full of the kind of pride that made a village elder nervous. He was a man obsessed with the glitter of modern life, too eager to shed the primitive burden of tradition, and that eagerness was his blind spot. Chinya, though she loved her husband deeply, felt a familiar tremor of dread. She remembered the words of Momangozi, the village seer, years before, when Paul first mentioned his plan to sell the land. The ground of our fathers must not be disturbed. If you build your empire on the burial place of your reverence, your foundation will be swallowed by the earth you mocked. Paul had laughed, Chinya had not. The prophecy was specific and delivered with the weight of ages. The man who authorized the disturbance of the sacred grove would be rewarded with great status, a temporary elevation, but the wealth would not truly be his. Instead, he would become a servant to the wealth, and his status would be no more than that of a guard, watching over what he once owned, never truly possessing it. The ultimate price, Momangozi warned, was that his firstborn son would lose his voice to the silence of the violated ancestors. Chinya had pleaded with Paul to reconsider, citing the history of their people, the legends that formed their moral core, but Paul was resolute. Superstition, Chinya. That old woman is just angry we are moving on from her generation's dusty tales. This is progress. This is my opportunity, he declared, swatting away her concerns like a bothersome fly. Now, looking at the signed documents, her hands trembled, and she felt the heavy shadow of the Iroko tree stretching across their bright, new future. Their son, 10-year-old Daniel, was asleep in the next room, dreaming of a new bicycle the money would buy him. Chinya prayed the ancestors would value their intent over their action, that the ambition of a man might be forgiven. The move was swift. Paul's new wealth bought them a sprawling, modern house on the edge of the new estate, complete with high walls, manicured lawns, and a silent security system. It was a palace compared to the cozy, imperfect home they left behind. Paul, true to the company's word, was made the estate's chief site supervisor, giving him authority over all the workers and full access to the project's details. He walked with a new strut, his traditional robes replaced by crisp, modern uniforms. The villagers who once hailed him as a promising son now regarded him with a mix of awe and pity, a strange, quiet distance growing between him and his roots. Only Chinya saw the subtle changes in her husband, the way his laughter was forced, the constant tension in his shoulders, the deep, sleepless circles under his eyes. He was rich, yes, but he was not peaceful. He seemed more like a prisoner in his own prosperity. Their son, Daniel, was the picture of health and happiness. He loved the new house, the shiny floors, and the enormous television, but Chinya noticed he was talking less. At first, she dismissed it as the quiet focus of a boy obsessed with his new video games. But soon, his silence became a pattern. He would not answer a direct question, not because he was ignoring her, but because the words seemed to fail him. He'd look at his mother with wide, desperate eyes, and open his mouth, only for a dry, choked sound to escape. A doctor assured them it was a phase, perhaps stress from the move, and prescribed patience and play. But Chinya knew. She remembered Mama Ngozi's words, he will lose his voice to the silence of the violated ancestors. The boy was literally unable to speak his name, the name given to him by the same ancestors whose resting place Paul had sold for concrete and glass. One evening, Paul came home from the construction site, reeking of sweat and cheap liquor. He collapsed onto the sofa, his face a mask of exhaustion and despair. The construction company, he confessed to a terrified Chinya, had hit a roadblock. They were demanding more of his time, more dangerous work, and paying him late. His supervisory role was slowly being downgraded, piece by piece. He was sinking deeper into debt, buying things to keep up the appearance of the wealth that was slipping through his fingers. They treat me like a common guard, Chinya, he whispered, the truth stinging his tongue. His status had become a facade, a temporary elevation that was crumbling. Chinya sat beside him, the cold fear finally crystallizing into bitter certainty. The prophecy was not just a threat, it was an exact map of their impending ruin. She looked at her son, sitting silently by the window, unable to call out to his father, and she knew the time for pleas was over. It was time for a desperate, dangerous choice. The shift was brutal and swift. The construction company, facing a financial crisis, decided to cut costs aggressively. Paul's contract as chief site supervisor was terminated abruptly, replaced by a simple security post, gatekeeper for the very estate he helped build on his family's sacred soil. The expensive house they lived in was tied to the supervisory role. Without it, they had 3 weeks to move out. Paul, consumed by shame, refused to tell anyone. He put on the scratchy uniform of a security guard every morning, driving the long way to the main gate of the estate to stand guard over the magnificent homes and walls that were now not his. He spent his days watching the wealthy new residents drive past him, waving dismissively at the man who was technically their ancestors' landlord, now a mere sentry. The prophecy had truly delivered its cruel twist. He had become a servant to the wealth, his status no more than that of a guard, watching over what he once owned, never truly possessing it. Chinya, however, saw the opportunity in the humiliation. She saw the gate, the point of entry, as the last remaining connection to the cursed land. She knew Paul's pride would never allow him to confess his fall from grace. He would continue to pretend to be the wealthy supervisor until the eviction notice came. She had to act alone. She took Daniel, her silent son, and returned to the old village of Yo. She went not to her friends, but directly to the hut of Mama Ngozi, the seer whose prophecy had become their chilling reality. The old woman sat weaving in the dimly lit hut, her eyes, milky with age, still possessing a profound depth. Chinya fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Mama," she choked out, "the prophecy has taken hold. Paul is a gateman, and my son cannot speak. Tell me, Mama, is there a ritual? A price we can pay to reverse what we did? Mama Ngozi looked at the boy, who stared blankly at the floor, and shook her head slowly. The ancestors do not trade their peace for gold, Chinya. The debt is one of humility, not currency. She explained that the violation was not just the physical act of digging up the land, but the pride that led to the act, the belief that modern man's convenience was superior to the ancient wisdom. The only way to partially lift the curse and allow Daniel's voice to return was for the man who signed the deed, Paul, to publicly confess his pride and serve the land he defiled, not as a paid guard, but as a humble caretaker. And that act of true humility had to occur on the new estate's grounds, for all the new residents, who benefited from his greed, to witness. It was a steep price, public shame, the death of his arrogance, and the complete forfeit of the illusion of his worth. He must serve the land, Chinye, not the company, Mama Ngozi concluded. He must care for the one thing they cannot build on, the smallest patch of earth the bulldozers forgot. Chinye knew this would be the hardest test. Paul's ego was vast, a wall stronger than the concrete of the new estate. To admit his folly in front of the very people he had sought to impress was a form of death for him. The 3-week deadline loomed like a hungry beast. Chinye returned home to find Paul frantic. The company had begun to transfer the remainder of their belongings out of the house, giving him 24 hours to vacate. The pretense was over. He confessed his demotion, his shame, his despair. In his breakdown, Chinye found her moment. She did not condemn him, she showed him the path of redemption. She told him of Mama Ngozi's requirement, of the only chance for Daniel. It is not about the money, Paul, she whispered, holding his broken hand. It is about our son's voice. Which is more valuable to you, your pride or your family's future? The next morning, Paul did not put on the security uniform. He donned his old, faded work clothes, took the dusty hoe he hadn't touched since he became rich, and walked not to the gate, but to the estate center, to a small, neglected, triangular patch of overgrown weeds that was originally planned for a flagpole, the only ground the company had left undisturbed. Chinye and Daniel followed, their hearts pounding in unison. Paul knelt, not as a wealthy supervisor or a paid guard, but as a farmer, a son of the soil. He began to pull weeds, to till the hard earth, to restore the dignity of the ground. The wealthy residents, driving by in their luxury cars, pointed and laughed at the fallen supervisor, the gate man who was now playing in the dirt. But Paul did not look up. He walked, slowly, deliberately, a man shedding a layer of toxic pride with every turn of the hoe. As the sun reached its zenith, Paul whispered to the earth, a confession to the unseen ancestors. He begged forgiveness for his arrogance and for valuing steel over soul. Chinye watched, tears of relief blurring her vision. And then, she heard it, a sound. Daniel, still silent, reached out and gently touched his father's dirt-caked hand. He looked up at Paul, and a single, wet, choke syllable escaped his lips, not a word, but a sound of acknowledgement, a sign that the silence was being broken. Paul continued his service to the small patch of land. He did not leave the estate after the eviction. He and Chinye, with Daniel, moved into the tiny, concrete utility shed near the gate, a stark, humiliating contrast to their former palace. Yet, the shed held more peace than the mansion ever had. Paul spent his mornings tending the soil, and in the evenings, he would walk Daniel there, showing him the tiny, determined sprouts of native flowers and herbs he had nurtured back to life. He spoke to the boy, not expecting an answer, but teaching him the names of the plants, the wisdom of the earth, the simple truths he had forgotten. He did not get another paid job, he only cared for that tiny, forgotten piece of earth. He was now a true caretaker, his life a living apology. The residents still drove past, but the laughter had faded, replaced by a quiet, confused respect for the man who had traded a life of luxury for a life of honest labor. The true breakthrough came 6 months later. The small, revitalized patch of land had become an unlikely garden, an oasis of green in the harsh, sterile concrete environment. The air around it felt different, softer, more ancient. One afternoon, a young resident's child wandered toward the garden and attempted to pick one of Paul's cherished aloe vera plants. Paul, instinctively protective, rushed over. "No, son, don't touch that," he warned, his voice a low, firm rumble. The child, startled, started to cry. Daniel, who was watching from the utility shed door, suddenly rushed out. He stood between his father and the crying child, his chest puffed out, and then, slowly, deliberately, he spoke his first full, clear word since the prophecy began. "Mine," he said, pointing not to the plant, but to the ground. Mine." The word was clear, strong, and full of the power of possession, not of wealth, but of connection. Paul fell to his knees, not in shame this time, but in overwhelming relief and gratitude. His son had spoken, the ancestors had accepted his service. Daniel's voice did not return all at once. It came back in whispers, then phrases, and finally, in clear, melodic sentences. His first extended conversation was with his father, not about the estate, but about the secrets of the tiny garden. Paul, listening to his son's laughter and full speech, felt the weight of the prophecy finally lift. The irony was profound. The price of a clear foundation was the destruction of the physical house they built on a lie. They had lost the mansion, but they had gained back their son's life, and, more importantly, Paul's true identity. He was no longer a supervisor or a gateman, he was a husband, a father, and a man who had been humbled back into wisdom. The climax of their redemption was a quiet affair. Mama Ngozi, brought to the estate by Chinya, stood at the edge of Paul's garden. She did not offer a ritual or a chant, she simply smiled. "The land demands respect," she said, her voice soft but echoing with authority. "When the heart is replanted in the earth it left, the weeds of pride wither." She explained that the small patch Paul had nurtured was exactly where the ancient rites had been performed, the one spot the company had missed. By returning to service, Paul had not just appeased the ancestors, he had found his own peace. He and Chinya used the last of their savings to buy a small piece of land outside the estate walls, and Paul became a simple, respected local farmer, selling his produce to the estate residents who had once mocked him. The family's debt was paid in humility, and the great wealth they chased was replaced by the simple, priceless joy of their son's voice, a constant melody in their new, humble home. Daniel, the boy who could not speak, grew up to be a storyteller, his voice carrying the moral echo of his family's painful lesson, ensuring the prophecy would never be ignored again. Paul never regained his status as a supervisor, nor did he ever chase the phantom of easy wealth again. But every morning, he watched Daniel laugh as he helped tend the small, fertile farm, and he knew he was the wealthiest man in the whole region. He had traded a mansion built on a lie for a small house built on truth and humility. The most potent lesson is this: the true price of ignoring wisdom is never paid in money, it is paid in the currency of what you love most. And a heart that chooses the restoration of family over the preservation of pride, and humility over a hollow title, will always find its way back to peace. If this story moved you, hit like, share it, and tell me in the comments, what is the heaviest price you can pay for ambition? Subscribe to Stories by the King, where every story carries a heartbeat, and every choice carries a lesson. This is Stories by the King, where love wins, and purpose finds its home.